Welcome, everyone. Some familiar faces and some new faces. Wonderful to have everyone here this evening. We've got guests of current class. We've got friends of THNK. We've got collaborators, and we've got Class 1 alumni here as well. So a big welcome. Hi, Cam. A big welcome to everyone this evening and to the THNK Forum. So for those who have never been to a THNK Forum, and I'm Sarah, by the way, I should have introduced myself. I'm Sarah Dickinson, the co-founder of THNK here in Vancouver and the managing director. THNK Forum is one of the 4 elements of the 6-month creative leadership program. And there are 2 key objectives, learning objectives for the forum. One is more content related, another is process. So the content one first. What we're trying to get out of the forums is a sneak peek into the future, which is where our class have actually spent most of the afternoon. A look at what we call the paradigm shifts that are changing the way that we live, we work, we play. We're going to get a really good hint of things this evening from our guest. The other learning objective is more of a process one, and the art of engaging expertise. We have a bit of a hypothesis that we've become, with the wonders of the web, a little bit lazy in our ability to have face-to-face inquiry, to ask powerful questions of one another. And we believe that both these things, the act of asking questions and then the act of asking the right questions to envision a better future, are 2 essential tenets of creative leadership. And they're the 2 things that we're going to explore together this evening. I'm going to hand over now for a bit of an introduction to help us all get a little bit more acquainted. I'm going to hand over to Kaz Brescia.
To me?
Is it Kaz Brescia? Or are you Kaz Brescia? Because Kaz Brescia has never really looked like this before. And I've never seen our guests look quite like this before either. All will be revealed. She can't get out because her cape weighs about, exactly, 1 million pounds. She's resting this evening.
I'm actually going to hand over to our unknown bunny furry person.
Thank you.
Please, just take it away.
I have a mic. Okay, good. No, I don't feel the need for that security. So we thought we would just start by doing a little exercise in alter ego development. So if you want to choose one partner who's maybe sitting next to you, or maybe someone who you want to know a little bit better. And then we're going to do this first. So one of my passions is basically identity hacking. So figuring out ways that we can get in touch with all these different beings who we have inside of us who might not be living out all their potential. So tonight, we're going to do that by starting. So can I ask you a question?
Sure.
All right. What part of yourself are you really exhausted by? Sorry, you can ask me.
My fixation with I don't know how to say it without whatever. My fixation on perfection.
So, your perfectionistic side. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
So what is the opposite energy of that perfectionistic person? What is the opposite of perfectionism?
Sort of just like, I don't want to say slovenly, but kind of like roll with it. Like, I don't know, like beat poet, sort of, I don't know.
Beat poet.
Okay, all right. I'm in the wrong costume.
I don't know. I've known some beat poets who like
okay.
capes.
All right, okay.
Beautiful. So you're going to be a beat poet for this evening. I expect you to ask me really beat poetical questions.
Down.
Awesome.
Great.
So for myself,
what part is most vexatious about your,
my bunny life?
When you get in there, what downs you, man?
I mean,
Rape.
I like it.
Come on.
So Yeah, I mean, yeah, I feel like I'm always, you'll get this, like rabbit holes, you know rabbit holes? Like I feel like I'm always going down these rabbit holes.
I do know.
And I know because you do other stuff that make you know that more. But yeah, so I feel like I'm nomadic, I'm all over the place. I just want to be that bunny at the bar who just is like always at the bar in the same chair, who you just like know and you just talk to.
Okay.
And then I know everyone else.
Like Cheers? Like Cheers?
Never seen Cheers, but yes.
Bunnies?
Cheers Bunny.
Cheers
Boston.
Bunny.
Yeah, that's who I want to be.
Okay. All right.
Great.
So
Now we invite each of you to do this. So basically the format for the exercise is turn to your partner. You each get 1 minute. Ask your partner what they're exhausted by in themselves, in their own life. Then identify the opposite energy of that. So perfectionism emerges to sort of like live in the flow, which becomes beat poet. After you identify the energy that is the opposite, choose a persona that owns that energy. Does that make sense? Yeah. All right, cool. And then after that, we'll do rapid introductions where everyone has to say, you have to introduce your partner.
Yeah.
So introduce your partner's new alter ego.
Yes.
Cool.
Okay.
So 2 minutes.
Ready? Go. Okay, we'll go last.
Yeah.
You two. Who are you? Stand up quickly. Give the name of the alter ego and one quick sentence.
Well, this is...
Loudly so everyone can hear you, please.
This is Keith. He doesn't really know where he's at. Sometimes he does, actually, but he doesn't really care. If you need to come to him for help, he might help you, he might not. Is he exploring or does he already know where he is? Doesn't matter. It's Keith. All right.
Keith. Okay, wait. Keith, who's that? Who is it? Pete?
And Pete can really just give to everyone and anyone, and it never exhausts him because he has this like limitless reservoir of energy that he can just always give, and it never drains him. It's great.
Good person to know. Good person to know. Keith. All right.
I'd like to introduce you to my friend 9 to 5 Pete. Focus is his middle name. He likes to focus on one, probably a little idea, and persistently follow that, a little bit like the rabbit hole. There's a common theme around here, but he's very, very focused. 9 to 5, 5:05, he's kind of done. Back home, kind of run-of-the-mill kind of stuff, and he's just a bit of a homebody. Likes to hates planes, and just likes to just stay at home and focus on his persistent P.
We're lucky he's here then.
We're very lucky. This is a very rare occasion.
And who do you have here at 95P?
This is Molly. Molly works at a farm. She makes goat cheese. And during the weekends, she does indigo dye.
Indigo dye.
Indigo dye. Okay, I can sense some other activities happening in the breaks. One, we are lucky.
Very physical.
Very good. And homeschooling.
Okay.
Okay, and you never forget a birthday, right? Okay. And who have we got back behind? Thank you, Molly 95P. Okay, who have we got at the table?
This is Atina.
Atina!
It's a backward spelling of her real name. She's a party girl, and she parties all night, sleeps all day, does everything backwards, and she has no care in the world.
We know Atina.
And this is Siddhartha.
Siddhartha.
Siddhartha is a Buddhist monk.
Oh.
He is not attached to anything. He has given up thinking that there's something more to achieve because he has landed.
He's landed.
Inside and out.
You two sound like a good pair. Good pair. Okay. All right. Well, what we're gonna do, we may have missed a couple of people, but we're gonna keep going. We have some incredible characters in the room, and I cannot wait for the break over more wine to get to know all of these alter egos. But it's time to turn our attention to Alexa Clay. You can keep the ears or not ears. We're now joined by Alexa Clay. And
Okay, yeah. Which obscures slightly. I liked how many buckets there were, though, in different manifestations, like Rasta bucket or like Ayn Rand bucket or like.
It's really true. Clearly, no one here cares about anything.
Yeah.
This is what's clear from the group. But I do want to just join Sarah and say thank you all for bringing yourselves and your alter egos and your open minds to join us tonight. If it hasn't already been pointed out to you, this session is also part of the Disruptive Innovation Festival, which is being put on by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, focused on new economies, innovation, and different ways to approach things. So we've gotten some feedback from people online, which we will weave in, and we will be looking to all of you to contribute questions during the break as well, from yourselves or your alter egos. So feel free to choose. But we are very lucky to be joined by Alexa Clay, whose most recent book, The Misfit Economy, has put her in touch with all kinds of crazy characters, so she's very at home here. And this is one of many pursuits that she has, which we'll be touching on. And most of you have, I think, looked at the Think Ahead document. So I thought what we would do is we would start with a short kind of Q&A to orient us, and then we will take about a 15-minute break during which participants will then be grouping themselves around key themes that they're interested in, and we'll be coming up in those groups, and we'll be collecting questions from all of the rest of you as well to weave into those series of questions. So what I thought I would do, Alexa has a lot of different things to play with, and the alter ego exercise partially comes out of the work you've done as the Amish futurist. So for those of you tonight, we've been joined by Stephanie instead of the Amish futurist. But I wonder, you talked a little bit about identity hacking, and I just wondered if you could share a bit about where the Amish futurist came from and some of the intentions.
Yeah, I mean, first, the origin of alter egos was really to escape like this version of myself. So the more that I found that I had to sort of commodify myself as like a brand, and also increasingly sort of package myself as on LinkedIn or on Facebook, or even develop alexaclay.com. I think actually that was the moment when I had to start my own website where I cringed and decided that I actually wanted to flee into other characters. So the origin of the Amish character is partially from this, partially because I was walking around Berlin and I went into a vintage store and there was an amazing prairie plain Amish-like dress. And then partially because I was really fed up with the startup scene and the tech scene. And so what I started doing was dressing up as this Amish woman, Rebecca, and going to tech events and conferences and asking people really difficult questions about the sort of bigger intention behind what they were doing. You know, so how could we bring more sort of existential anxiety to startup founders about like the potential meanings of their app? And I did it through the persona of someone who's like very sensitive and like confused about things, not like from a place of judgment, but just of like ignorance.
Question type of question.
Yeah, totally. So I went to one event in Berlin, and people, well, I think partially people just would come up to me because I just around, and they come up to me and they're like, oh, where are you from? I'm like, Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I'm just here to explore technology. And then they start, I think a lot of people would have this moment where first they would be wanting to tell me some of their own fears about technology, because I would sort of be like, oh, sometimes I'm really scared by like what I see people on this Facebook thing. It seems very vain. Like I suddenly had access to this whole moral so I could use a lot of that, like I use the word sin a lot, or vanity, or selfishness, or narcissism, which like you can't really call people out on, but you can in like a gentle, bonneted way. And then they would sort of say, oh yeah, I have this, you know, another question actually that we would ask is like, well, what were some of your first experiences of technology? And everyone would go into this moment of sort of magical, like, oh, the first time I was in a chat room, or when I was using email, or something like this. And that was beautiful because it had this sort of nostalgia and magic to it, and it was so disconnected often from their experience of digital technology in everyday life that was much more routine and ritualized and addictive. So that was part of it, and a lot of it, I think it opened up this confessional space. Like people would suddenly start saying all their technophobias, like, oh, I don't like how this is being done about technology. So it was just a way to sort of hack the narrative from one of like techno-optimism to just sort of like technological critique or sort of greater intentionality. One person like had this existential crisis one and just said everything I'm doing is meaningless. Like there is no bigger meaning to the technology that I'm developing. So that was sort of joyous, but then I didn't really know how to sort of follow on from that. Like I felt like I'd provoked something and then sort of just like wandered away. But the hope is that there's like a bigger movement of people that are connected to intentional technology.
And so just out of curiosity, so in following that thread and sort of, sometimes this happens if I'm traveling somewhere and I know a little bit of the language, I'll ask someone something in the language and they start to answer quickly and then I'm lost. It's just, lost the plot instead of owning who I am and the edges of my knowledge. So as you started to develop this character, did you spend time researching and delving into that mindset, or how much of it was and in the moment, almost letting something come through or playing what you imagine the character to be?
Yeah, I think it was more of an archetype. Like for me, it was actually, it wasn't a character. Like my mom is an actress. I am the opposite of an actress. It was a way of channeling this moral voice that I wanted to channel. It was also a way of getting into this different sort of femininity that I thought was interesting. I knew a little bit about Amish people, and I've ended up spending more time in like researching Amish culture. But yeah, someone asked me once, like when I was doing this, like the history of the like Mennonite immigration, and I just knew nothing about where like the Amish came from. So then I ended up going to a museum in Indiana where I learned a lot about that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it was more, I think with alter egos, it's important that they're not schizophrenic identities. Like they're not something out there role you have to inhabit, but it's just a part of yourself that you want, that's maybe you don't have full access to, that you want to sort of bring to the surface a little bit.
And we talked a little bit this morning actually about that claiming or owning a voice, and when is it that a certain voice that you hesitate, and you talked a little bit about moral language or certain kinds of language that you bring out. And one question I have is, in the tech scene, we spent much of today delving into sort of futuristic perspectives on technology. What language is missing, and what do you seek more of as you're contributing back?
I think, yeah, it is a moral language that's missing. I think there's also a sort of humanistic language that's missing. I think there's just something really horrific, like in tech culture, that it sort of parades itself as this new economy, but a lot of the historic issues that we've had to deal with are still there. So this is very much in like a lot of the bro culture that's in tech culture. I find that really disturbing about how sort of patriarchy is taking this like beta geek form. And it's not there, but it's sort of there in this like different aesthetic. So yeah, I think definitely a moral language, one of more sort of like existential thoughtfulness, one of longer time horizons. So like really what is the sort of bigger picture here? Another script is shifting from this sort of lone ranger entrepreneur identity to one of more like collaborative entrepreneurship, to slow adoption. So like I'm not the first to like try out this new app or but actually, what is the impact of this thing on my well-being, on my sense of like intimacy in the world, on my communication, on my relationships. So those are some of the things, yeah.
And so jumping off of that, so another one of the groups that Alexa's involved in, like 10 million different groups, so there's a lot of things to talk about, but one of them is called the Black Sheep. And we recently shared the back of an old Barbara Mandrell touring bus. Going like, through the middle of the U.S. Like literally, horrible. It was absurd.
Like there was a queen bed in the back of the bus, and you couldn't sleep because every time like you
had to hold on the side of the bus. It was amazing. Yeah. But part of what we were looking at were changing narratives, and what are the dominant narratives in a culture, both coming from the media as well as what are the narratives on the ground, bottom up, related to change. And one of the things we talked about was this narrative around entrepreneurship and how entrepreneurship is becoming somewhat calcified around the hipster image, the kind of bro culture. And the minute you go into the center of the country, you realize there are a lot of people quite resentful because entrepreneurship used to mean innovating and making ends meet and being creative, especially when you didn't have a choice. And now there's this sense of fuck the man and I'm gonna quit my job and I'm an entrepreneur, and they want to medal for it. And so we talked a little bit about the damage that's doing and how do you reclaim or take subcultures and bring those back into narratives. So I'm curious.
Yeah, it felt like a bit on the bus tour. We went to a lot of cities from like New Orleans to Mobile, Alabama, up through to Baltimore. We were there actually when a lot of the peace protests were erupting, to Pittsburgh, to Detroit, to Kansas City, to St. Louis, Tulsa. And so a lot of these cities that are sort of poised for this Phoenix moment. Maybe every other week there's a New York Times article like, startup scene moving to Cincinnati or something. And so we went to a lot of those places. And it was really obnoxious, actually, in many ways, to see how this Silicon Valley culture was sort of colonizing a lot of these places with its own set of values. And so I guess one of the reflections was really, well, yeah, entrepreneurship actually, you know, when I took a course in entrepreneurship in high school, it was a remedial course basically for people that didn't, you know, we just like played video games about like lemonade stand, it was called, and learned how to spell entrepreneurship for like the class. That's like all that you did. And now it's, yeah, this shiny kind of hot thing. And so I think, how do we think about entrepreneurship differently? Like for many people, it is still this like brick and mortar concept. It's still about getting by. There was an amazing entrepreneur we met in New Orleans in the 9th Ward who was just setting up a grocery store for people to get access to really simple sort of like produce and not have to commute for 45 minutes or like walk 2 miles to access food in this kind of food desert situation. So I think with the Misfit Economy too, the whole point is there's a whole slew of people in the informal economy, in the black market economy, you know, outside the Silicon Valley who are entrepreneurs or using an entrepreneurial mindset who we just pay no attention to. And it was really disgusting to see how there were these tech hubs emerging. It was really prominent in Raleigh, Durham, where, you know, you have millions and millions of dollars on the one side of town and all these like hubs and co-working spaces and sort of, you know, communities that are emerging. And then on the other side of town, you have absolutely no access to that resource. And so for the tech community, there's this moment right now where so much is being privatized, where, you know, it used to be companies had more of a social contract with the places that they were in. And that's really fading away. And I think that's really terrifying.
I mean, it absolutely is, and it's interesting to see how it expresses itself. And one of the things Sarah mentioned, not only in the curriculum that the forum has goals, but we work on creative leadership model competencies. And this module, we're focused on orchestrating creative teams. Yeah. And part of that has to do with how you navigate clash, how you identify difference to create teams, what happens when things are shifting. And I love this quotation. You've written about yourself that you use conversation as a tool for understanding the state of the world. You use conversation to find connection, and you use conversation for play. And a lot of what happened on the bus tour was conversation and bridging. I'm curious if you have any tips or concrete ways that you found to bridge. I mean, I'll think of Tulsa. I have an image burned in my head of a guy in a tie and a Hummer proudly displaying the eagle coming out of the pile of money and Kim Jong-il in the back. Like, it's a little hard to discuss.
What is that called? Like, he literally graffitied his car with like America, yeah.
It's amazing. So how do you use conversation to create bridges and connection when there's real difference to drive change forward? I'm curious what your experience has been there.
I mean, I think that was part of the impetus with the bus trip, is that we are all living in these little bubbles. And so one of the great pleasures of doing the Misfit Economy was not sort of writing the book, which was more painful as a process, but actually just getting out of, I worked a lot with social entrepreneurs. I worked at Ashoka. I worked with people in multinational companies to do sustainability strategy. And then suddenly I was talking to gangsters and pirates and performance artists and all these sort of people that didn't have, that weren't curated. I hadn't realized how curated my existence had been. Like literally in college, you're sort of meeting people through like the SAT scores they have, which is crazy, and even potentially marrying those people. So it was, I mean, that was really enjoyable, and I found myself really philosophically aligned. Like one of my earlier conversations in the research process was with King Tone, who led the Latin Kings, which was a Hispanic street gang, and he even pushed back against the use of the word gang. He said, call us an organization like any other, because we do recruitment and we do retention when we have a brand. And we were driving in his car, and he even played for me this kind of self-help like tape that every member of the gang has that was all around leadership development. Yeah. And so for me, it's just, you know, both my parents were anthropologists. Like my mother went around the world talking to people who thought they'd been abducted by aliens. So I was always exposed to people with very different kinds of consciousness and ideas, and trying to find common ground with those people in some way. So question asking and like getting into why space with people, I think, is really important. And it was the sort of basis too for work I used to do in the corporate sector with entrepreneurs. A lot of my sort of research, or how I sort of feel into the future, is just to sit. I don't watch like videos, I don't really read books, I just like sit with people and really get into a level of conversation that is about intuition and about what we're feeling collectively. And if there's a philosophical shorthand for it, I sort of believe in this idea of like mesh prophecy, that like rather than this idea of like there's one futurist or there's one prophet who's like proclaiming what the future is, Elon Musk style, actually like we all have a little bit of the future that's emerging. And so how do we get ourselves into this space where we can begin to use sense making to articulate that more? So, you know, with various things that I've done, we try and put conversations together to get people into that space.
Yeah, well, since you touched on entrepreneurs, we'll jump over to that really quickly. So I'm not sure if anyone here has heard of the League of Entrepreneurs, but it's just begun in Canada as well. So this has just started in September here, and Alexa's been part of the founding of that group. And obviously, as it sounds like, the League of Entrepreneurs is about creating change from within large companies. And I like the description here. It says, with the announcement about this opening in Canada, it said, while social and creative destruction are required to move Canadians toward a socially inclusive and sustainable future, change will also need to originate from existing institutions. And you have a toolkit there. So as we talked about concrete ways to do this, there's a Cubicle Warriors toolkit. Highly recommend you check it out. And it has examples and tools like making the business case, don't raise your voice, improve your argument. So I'm curious, in working with entrepreneurs and now social entrepreneurs, what are you starting to see as the conditions or contexts that help make them successful within an organization? Because there can be all the passion, but what do we need to be creating around that for change?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first step of this movement was very similar to the social entrepreneurship movement, in the sense that it was first just identifying these people that weren't just these excellent sheep, right? They were people that were trying to bring all their passions and their human concerns into the workplace. So like Dave Burdish, who worked, you know, third generation at Ford Motor Company, could get the company to develop better human rights practices, or get them to develop, you know, beyond just car manufacturing, how would they navigate urban transport solutions? And so I think there is a lot, first of all, the need for just like a personality that can bring that kind of like grit and nonconformity into the workplace. And then there's just, yeah, there's a whole slew, like the thing that this community needed the most, which is why the League developed, was support systems. So the League of Entrepreneurs started as like an Alcoholics Anonymous type group for really disruptive types of personalities within companies to come together and just share their war stories and get feedback from each other, and just have this moment where they felt understood and they felt like they were with other people from their species. I think a lot of that being seen or sort of witnessing is really critical for them, because they don't abide by the success metrics that a lot of other types of actors within those companies abide by. And so it can be a really lonely journey. Like, so many of them don't get promoted because they're doing this crazy innovation thing. And so while they might have CEO support or support from senior leadership, and have that protection, it's not like they're, you know, they're sort of recognized by their peers in these standard ways. And then there's, yeah, so the more they could develop their own entourages of support, the more, like, if you're an entrepreneur, success within your organization is other people running with your idea. So you quickly have to learn how to sort of let go of that ego drive and how to build consensus around it. They're extremely political. So, you know, being able to understand the motivations of other people, being able to understand how change happens in organizations, building key alliances around things. And then this question of like enabling environment, like what do the companies do, has been one that we're just starting to play into more, because it really has been more a guerrilla movement of getting these entrepreneurs together. And I was talking about this recently at a conference, and someone came up to me and was like, what about saboteurs and whistleblowers? Like, there are all these other agents within companies who aren't like happily productive members of the company. And I thought that was kind of interesting. because yeah, there are these people that actually want to bring these companies down from the inside, and maybe they have a political agenda, or maybe they're just like this subversive presence. But I also think that's really interesting. Like, what's the role of these old institutions in helping us to get to this emergent future? And in many cases, a lot of them will go extinct and they won't have a role to play. And so that's why I've tried to hedge my own work beyond just the hypothesis of like internal change agent, because I feel like that's only one part of the solution.
So I feel like all of these threads kind of come together for you in some ways, where you have these identities in different groups, you know, the Ashoka background and the black sheep, and you've got all of these things, and they're starting to come together and connect through the neo-tribe work that you've begun to do. This is extremely nascent, so I asked Alexa to talk a little bit about it and talk about the POC stuff and Paris. So what is a neo-tribe, and what is this about?
Yeah, so I guess I realized that I stopped having a traditional job and stopped being part of traditional organizations, and increasingly I was a part of networks and movements and various communities. And so neo-tribes evolved really recently, basically in September, because I was at this thing called POC 21, which happened outside Paris, and was basically a 5-week immersion of eco-hacker types who were building different climate change solutions. So it was a provocation to the Paris talks. Rather than saying we're doing this like diplomacy thing that's just based in conversation, these were people that are taking action and building the groundwork for a new kind of society that is less dependent on fossil fuel. So that was wonderful, but it also was interesting because it was a mashup of very different cultures. So we had these engineers, this maker energy that were really focused on just like getting their shit done. And for me coming in, this was really disheartening because you had almost this old industrial factory energy being created in what I felt should have been this new society. And I think this happened. There's an essay called The Tyranny of Structurelessness, which is when you're not really intentional about the protocols that you're creating as part of a new community, you're just going to take all the baggage of the old system and it's going to recreate itself. And so that got me really interested in what we could harvest from various communities, movements, even sort of eco-villages, like from hippie experiments in the 60s. Like, let's audit those and let's figure out what the different best practices of community making are. And so neo-tribes is an umbrella for that work. And we just started a Facebook group where people from all these different tribes around the world, started sharing their own experiences. And we're trying to grow this group of amateur ethnographers so that we can document the different practices that these communities are using. And yeah, it's just starting, but it's like where I have a lot of excitement too, because it's playing this role of sort of bridge building between all these different communities, and it's part of this moment of the mashup. Like, none of us are part of these like stagnant sort of communities anymore, or traditional communities. We can learn and borrow and steal from, you know, from Scientology. Like, they must have done one interesting thing that we can steal for like changing the world. I don't know. I haven't read this new book that's come out, but I'm sure there's one thing. Yeah.
So the last question before we break is then, you know, so the way it's defined on the site is that neo-tribes is really about a recognition that we've now evolved to live beyond mass society and we're returning to tribal roots. Now that may mean many different things, and we've also talked about how fringe itself tends, we'll loop back to the beat poet, right? The fringe becomes mainstream at some point, and hipster culture, hacker culture, all of these things are now really entering mainstream, and you've spent all this time kind of living on the gray edges. The question is, as we're looking at that emerging future, where do you see the sparkles of the most interesting current fringe?
Ooh. I guess I see it in many different places. After doing the entrepreneur work, I became really interested in people that were trying to build alternatives. So LARPing, like live action role playing. It's like
stuff.
One of the
I forgot about that.
Like glittery spaces, bright spaces that I see. So I think LARPing, who knows what live action
role playing?
We
LARPing?
know, some of us. Okay, so traditionally this is like nerds running around in the woods with swords. But do not be deceived. Yeah. But it also has the potential to be taken over by social revolutionary people as a way of prototyping alternative futures. So rather than talk about like oh, what will the future of finance look like? I can actually set up a LARP around it where I invite people to participate in a weekend where they can immerse in this type of experience. Or if you want to know like the future of relationships, like come to enjoy this LARP where we have different types of social contracts. So for me, I've just spent the summer really interviewing a bunch of LARPers, specifically in the Nordic LARP scene, which is a little, yeah, super pretentious and apparently way better than what we do in America. But I think that type of thing has a lot of potential. I also think there's a lot of potential in connecting people in the black markets and informal economies to sort of mainstream entrepreneurship. And so, you know, all of these people that are in prison that are amazing hustlers, who ran businesses, how do we actually connect them to like formal incubators and sort of use all these assets that we have as part of this emergent tech community and connect that to people that have been marginalized.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, welcome back. Grab your last wine. Okay, so what we're going to do is now we typically kind of go into a bit of a fishbowl style, and we'll weave in some of the questions that we've gotten from the folks who are paying attention to the Disruptive Innovation Festival. If you didn't get us your post-it from the audience, feel free to pass it to the side to one of our helpers floating around, and they will magically appear it over here. Okay, so our first group, and just one other note, which is that this is also an opportunity, in addition to asking the question, to follow a Socratic dialogue process. So we don't know where these things will go, but we have a starting point, and we'll kind of dive deeper. So who's asking your
I will kick things off. Well, it's one of the advantages of going first is you have a question and I can just get it out. So you have infiltrated some pretty interesting groups, I would say. It sounds like you know, you've gone far and wide finding probably some dangerous groups too, and you've got on the inside. And I'm wondering if those conversations have ever found you learning something about these groups that you either think, wow, I should take that to the outside world, back to the mainstream, or that has attracted you so much to make you think, maybe these are my people and this is where I belong?
Definitely Mexican drug cartels nuts. Yeah, I mean, I think it really was interesting to be in conversation with a lot of these gangsters from like, even in Bombay in India or in New York, and feel such a level of philosophical alignment. I think people were able to articulate such just systems issues, like the amount of like oppression that, for example, like the Latin Kings had to deal with in New York was just something that really affected me, like from learning people's stories from a young age of how they were sort of abused by the traditional educational system. So someone was just saying they're developing an alternative school for at-risk youth, which is like, well, get gangsters to be part of that co-creation in that alternative school because they know exactly how they've been disrespected and also the different skills that these youth need. So, you know, how do they learn risk management in a way that can be more effective? You know, how do they learn like various leadership skills? So yeah, I think there's been a great affinity. At times, the whole point of the book was not just to profile people in black market or informal economies, but really to profile culture hackers. So even within, for example, the Latin Kings, it was King Tone specifically who we chose because he was trying to pivot the gang from being a sort of deadly street organization into a civic movement like the Black Panthers. And I think each person in the book, wherever they fall in the law, has this kind of misfit identity where they're trying to transform the cultures that they're existing in.
And did you ever feel like these are my people and this is where I belong? And
no, I guess I feel like it was more that there were certain things that I could sort of borrow, like hermits. I really loved that someone had the hermit alter ego because I grew up like outside Walden Pond and always loved just, I think hermit time is something I've incorporated into my life. And like the hermits that I read about, and there's also this e-newsletter, which is weird for hermits, where they like share about their different hermit experiences. And I think we need more of this. Like to me, the hermit solution is part of the intentional technology conversation because there was one startup I spoke to where they spent a year living on the island outside of Seattle, just thinking about like what is the thing we want to bring into the world, and really having sort of long-term perspective on that. Yeah, and then concretely, the book is divided into 5 practices that we feel like a lot of fringe entrepreneurs use that we can apply to mainstream systems. So like the hacker ethos, the hustling ethos, certainly around this theme of provocation. We talk a lot about pivoting in the book too, which isn't like lean startup pivots, but it's more the identity hacking thing. So how do you pivot your own personal identity? And so we profile a lot of people that sort of jump from one discipline to the next, or go, take these rabbit hole experiences where they find themselves having to bring these worlds together that were not formally united. But I was never like, oh, I'm going to join, underground hacker collective. Yeah.
Do you find, I'm just speaking because I'm looking at my teammates here and they're not grabbing the mic here, so so I'm going to ask this quick question, then pass it over to the other side. Are there motivations generally about improving the situation from which they've come, or is there revenge built into part of that?
It's really a mixed landscape of motivation. I think you definitely see like the self-interest motivation. You see a financial motivation. You see at times a social good motivation. There was even an identity thief that I spoke to that said, oh, I would only steal from someone I thought could take the hit. So there were those types of calculations. So yeah, there wasn't one, like, part of me really wanted to go into a lot of these fringe cultures and say, oh, here's a new script for how we can do capitalism better. But in fact, that wasn't the case. It was more a sort of transitional set of like coping philosophies that we can use to endure like a transitional economy moment. Yeah, cool. What about you guys? Is there any like underground sort of group or fringe culture that you feel like you have identification with?
Wonderful leading question.
Yeah.
So what we were really noticing and picking up on was a lot of shared language, and the archetypes of people that you're describing, the groups that you've connected with, sounds a lot like THNK. Sounds a lot like the people that are in the room sitting here.
Gangster edition.
Exactly. So bringing people from diverse backgrounds together who have this vision of creating a better world and new economies and all of that kind of stuff sounds a lot like what you've explored. So knowing that you've spent a little bit of time with THNK in Amsterdam and here in Vancouver, we're curious about the tribe of THNK that you've experienced, and if there's any connection or similarity, or just if you found identification within this tribe and how it's connected with other groups that you've encountered.
Yeah, what I like about a lot of THNK people is, and this is a compliment, but people feel lost in a good way. Like, people feel like they're owning their lostness. Because a lot of people feel lost and like pretend they're not lost. And I think it's really normal and natural to be lost right now, because I think we are in such a transitional economic moment. And so I love hanging with people and working with people who can just, really own that, where we can figure out sort of together like what the future looks like. And so people are asking themselves really existential questions about like who they are and what they should be doing. And everyone's always like, oh, I just quit my job like 2 days ago. Or is like freaking out or trying to do this thing where they're not trying to sort of put too much stuff into their future. And so that, I think THNK is a really good example of a neo-tribe that is emerging, and how you guys grow this tribe to me is really interesting. Like, what is a lot of the different groups that I study, one of the most important things is really the vibe. So like, what is the feeling proposition of that community? Because that's what creates stickiness within a community. And so, I'm seeing glimpses into what that is beginning to feel like, but I think it's important too that it's not dependent on a set of personalities. Like, if there are things that you guys are valuing, that becomes like ingrained in the culture beyond any sort of the whimsy of different people who have sort of leadership status. I would push THNK too to develop, more sort of decentralization for sure. Yeah.
So a couple of questions that came in from the audience related to that, and this idea of kind of authenticity and owning the lostness. Mm-hmm. There's a question from Ager Stew, at Ager Stew. And someone in the audience also confirmed this, which was how do you kind of reconcile the alter ego with an authentic engagement? And then there was a question here about what's the significance of authenticity in the process of innovating. So a lot of people will say fake it till you make it, and you see that kind of patina in people who are shifting or pivoting personalities. So what's your sort of take on that alter ego and authenticity?
We did a salon early on when I was exploring alter egos in San Francisco, and we just had this division in the group. Half of us thought that authenticity was a wonderful thing, and that, like, I went to Quaker school and I definitely know when I'm being authentic. True story. And then other people felt like, oh no, there's no like core to my essence. Like I could be all these different people. And so, yeah, that was sort of terrifying to realize that people have really different sort of relationships with authenticity. But for me, the alter ego is only ever a pathway to greater authenticity, because I think so often we, especially in the social change space, like I definitely lived out this script of myself as like this social change warrior, and sort of almost like entered more of this like martyr archetype for a period of time that was really unhealthy, and I felt like did a disservice to like the inner artist in me and all these other personalities that were existing. So I think in exploring alter egos, we just give ourselves access to all the different sort of elastic range that we have inside of us. So for me, it's very much, it's the irony is that in faking something or sort of in doing something pretend, like in being Amish, I'm actually being more myself than I get to on a regular basis.
We're not really sticking to sticking to a theme. I hope that's okay. But my thought was, if it's leading edge the way what you're doing and the ideas that you're bringing, and I was honing in a little bit on the entrepreneurship aspect of it, and so if it becomes more open, if it becomes less like an AA meeting, and it kind of, is there a risk that it gets co-opted?
Yeah, and it was really interesting because early on in the movement, we had an advisor who was part of like GSK's executive team say, keep this guerrilla, because if this comes from corporate strategy, it's like gonna die. Like the whole vibe of it will be transformed. So I really like that.
Did it work?
Yeah.
It stayed that way?
Yeah, and it's difficult because now sort of as companies are recognizing that they maybe like want entrepreneurship, how can they do that in a way that's authentic and that speaks to the sort of this more bottoms-up culture, as opposed to something that feels like it's being rolled out and then, hey, we're doing this thing called innovation. Yeah.
Great. Well, I'm going to invite another group. Does a group have follow-on questions related to entrepreneurship or something somewhat related? Who wants to come up? Carol's moving. Carol's on the go. Come on, team. Come on up. Yep. Thank you.
Yeah.
Want to explore embedding change agents in organizations or existing systems. When you are as a member of a fringe community, the perception is disempowerment. So from that position, how do you disrupt from within and change the power structure?
Where are you sitting? I think there are different strategies for creating change and hacking culture based on what your host environment is. So with entrepreneurs, it's a very different identity that you have to inhabit as a change agent because you have to be a little bit more camouflaged. So if you go out saying like, my agenda is to get Exxon to like invest, so versus like if I'm doing this radical alternative startup to finance, like I'm very out with that agenda because then I get media attention and and so I think what's really important, like from my role too, is like the choreography between the different types of actors and where they're sitting, if that makes sense. Because sometimes in performing the script of like the camouflage change agent versus like the radical, these people can lose empathy for each other. And so for me, what's really interesting is like, how do we bring allegiances and allyship between these different types of actors so they actually can take off those masks and be like, oh yeah, we're fighting together. And I think that's the next step. Like now we have like social entrepreneurs know who they are, like anarchists know who they are, like people that are part of like protest movements, and entrepreneurs increasingly know who they are. And so now that we have those identities established, it becomes easier to build, more communities that can be networked across very different types of scale and institutional
power. And that's the NEO that work that
I think part of it. I think it's NeoTribes is starting as a way of mapping best practices in community, but because the mapping is taking place at all different levels of community, from like an artist collective to an eco-village to a sort of the B Corp movement, we're actually gonna create relationships between these different groups. And so there is the power to do that. Then like what will our collective action as an ecosystem be? And then it becomes really interesting from a political perspective, I guess.
And what would the rules of engagement be for members of a collective and then therefore across these tribes to take care of themselves?
Yeah. Well, so we had this crazy conversation with the NeoTribes group about building like an unnation and creating this new like transnational political party and stuff. But we're still, so there's excitement in this space, but I think we're still just at the level of sort of learning, where the individual tribes are getting better at documenting. These are some of our practices and beginning to share those. So there's a group, for example, in New Zealand called Inspiral, and they came out of the Occupy movement and social entrepreneurs working together. And so they build a bunch of open source software. And it's a really interesting example because it's a fused culture between social justice culture and startup culture. And so they have this whole new set of practices that they use where they have a lot of decentralization, but then they know how to get shit done, and they use a lot of sort of business planning tools and stuff like that. So for me, I think it's more in this moment of like getting people to share practice before that meta layer of like, well, how do we exist with the meta tribe gets created. Yeah.
Sure. Cool. Alexa.
Yeah.
Having been a member of this entrepreneur tribe in my company these last few years, I'm really interested in a little bit more of an expansion on the dialogue opportunities with these other groups. And if in connection with that, there's an element of this resilience or taking care of each other. Because certainly in my own experience, it's sort of the rising star of the entrepreneur, and then there are times you kind of do need to kind of go for cover again. And it's not always the same people that rise back up and reconvene in that group of entrepreneurs. It's a very rare few. So the dialogue with other groups and resilience.
I think resilience was its own tool in the toolkit, as you might know, because it's just, you're fighting the antibodies of the system on a daily basis, right? And so how do you stay resilient? And so you need to be witnessed, you need to be heard, you need like entourages of support for people that can just, surround that. But then there's also a lot of knowledge lost. Like I think, I don't know if you found this at Shell, but certainly like in BP, we worked with people that were doing alternative energy projects. Amazing like death, and now maybe mild resurrection, and yet like there's a lot of knowledge and practice that's been lost. And so a lot of institutions, there's almost a psychological landscape there where you're not aware of the previous battles necessarily that have taken place within that corporate setting. And so even like an entrepreneur that we knew at the IDB was doing all this stuff and then left, and then someone else like 10 years later ended up taking over a lot of that work. And that was lucky because it was like there was this ghost within the organization that could be resuscitated. But I think that's super interesting. So how do you sort of create sort of living knowledge for entrepreneurs to tap into?
I'll just ask a question on that note from the audience, which is why are entrepreneurs from the 50s or 60s any different from those of today? And I guess it begs the question in terms of ghosts, are we tapping into sort of cross-generational, intergenerational knowledge bases from people who are doing that kind of work?
Who would be, sorry, do you mean like Mad Men style, like 50s, 60s? Like who would be an
whose question this is, but yeah.
It's more, entrepreneurs have been around for quite some time. They've existed for decades, centuries probably. So is it any different for them to be faced with the same challenges of being sabotaged, for example, by groups who are really resistant to change and are not on board? And how the struggles that the people have had, the entrepreneurs from the 50s and 60s, companies that have really flourished and seen dramatic change, how are they any different to the people that are trying to bring around change today? They still need to generate a strategic commitment from every department in their company in order to effect change.
So I'll just repeat the question because we're recording them. So the question was, there were plenty of entrepreneurs in the 50s and 60s in companies that flourished. How is their struggle any different than what's happening today?
I mean, I would say it's not terribly different. I mean, I think there are different things that are animating entrepreneurship today that are very different, which is there's a level of scale and bureaucracy that we haven't known at this level previously. There's companies in many ways have lost their social contract to society, and so many entrepreneurs that I see are trying to rebuild that in some ways. So it used to be like, in sociology, like 101, that this would be sort of like big circle would be society and the economy was like little circle in society. And then it got reversed where like big circle is the economy and society is this little circle becoming embedded. And some would argue now that like big circle is technology and then economy and then society. And so like as society becomes like marginalized within that process, a lot of the mandate of social entrepreneurship is to rebuild that sense of that sense of connection, that sense of responsibility. And so it was born out of the sort of corporate responsibility movement in a lot of ways, which was in response to activists. So in many ways, like activists gave entrepreneurs their license to operate within companies because companies suddenly needed to manage that. And so that's a nice sort of unrecognized form of allyship that's already existing. I think you've always had entrepreneurs, and I think you've always had like, one of the best courses I ever took was on the history of human agency, which is, from Antigone and like Greek times to taking a stand against, government to the sort of the challenges that like Durkheim spoke about within this like alienated society of like, what are, the sort of the heroic call to sort of be a human agent is a common struggle, and yet the forces are always a little bit different.
We talked this afternoon about, we're talking about the pace of change and exponential change, and I've been thinking a lot lately about this. What I feel is are the adaptability of people who are younger, the need to adapt, the need to keep pace, and the feeling that there is a certain zeitgeist that in some way we're all becoming more and more misfits. And I'd love to get your sense of whether this is something that is kind of, you feel is kind of coming up at a grassroots level where they may not be connected, but this is a sensibility around the way we are evolving due to the pace of change.
Yeah, I think it's definitely true. I have a set feeling and intuition that we're sort of entering into this moment where individual authenticity is more possible, where the future sort of economy was driven much more by a conformist, like you go to work, you wear this uniform, you're expected to do this, and the job takes ownership over you. And I think now the sort of creative revolution and what that means is that actually the economy needs to sort of be built around my own uniqueness. And so that's really exciting. And then it also comes with like challenges and, how much, I think it can be a little bit scary too. What if your authenticity gets like co-opted by a company to do something? So I am always a little bit more optimistic, but I think it's headed in that direction for sure.
I'm gonna draft off of that for a second. We had another question off of Twitter from Joan Poo, which had to do with how misfits bolster themselves in this culture that kind of worships perfection, and even within being a misfit, that there are rules. And I'll just bring up, remember that guy in New York, the Zuccotti Park guy? So Alexa and I were part of running a story hacking thing around the American narrative, and one of the guys, I didn't know it at the time, was unbelievably difficult. And of course, it was unsurprising later to figure out that he was the first member of the Occupy movement. And this morning we did an exercise called Bombs and Bridges, and we talked a little bit about that role and the role of when is being a misfit sort of helpful to moving the cause forward, and when is the misfit role really destructive, and what's that balance? So I'm just curious if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, sorry, what was their
It was
then I got distracted thinking about that guy.
I know, that guy was really
He was
something.
horrible.
He was something. But how misfits sort of bolster themselves in a culture that worships perfection, and how do you be a misfit when there's like even an idea of what being a misfit is?
I know, yeah. I always thought that was funny. Like this could have been that. It's like, oh, like.
Why is the book yellow?
Yeah.
Is that misfitty?
Yellow. No, I think there's like a logic in business books where they have to be red or yellow, like so that
Danger.
It's like buy them.
Okay.
And then the yellow and gold, like these are the Latin king colors too, so that's like a secret branding.
Okay. Secret branding.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. They're connected. Yeah, I mean, I think there's no one formula for walking the misfit path, obviously. I think, not with the entrepreneurs, like we tell them, don't be content being the lonely, misunderstood outsider. Like that identity doesn't get you very far. I know a lot of these kinds of people, like the Occupy Wall Street guy, who are just really addicted to a way of showing up in the world where they're incredibly critical and anti-authoritarian. And psychologically, like, that comes from somewhere, and like I often want to know about their relationship with their father, but like I think they need alter egos the most. I think it's an incredibly powerful element. Like I think sometimes being really critical and obnoxious is like, that's not a performance that I like to do, but I do think within the sort of orchestra of how change happens, sometimes those types of players can be really useful. But they can also really, like even within the Neo-Tribes group, we have another sort of personality that conforms to that. So I don't think misfits need to be equated with being just like contrarian outsiders. Like I very much try and have an outsider perspective, but am very sort of inclusive, and I feel like warm in the invitations and that I issue to people. So yeah, I think there are many different basically archetypes for different misfits. You have like underground misfits, you have sort of runaway misfits peeling off the system, you have insider misfits, and there shouldn't be like one formula or script for how that gets created.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, Aaron.
Just quickly off that, is there understanding that there's multiple types, oh yeah, there it is, on multiple types of misfits and archetypes of different misfits across the economy? Is there society, is there, there's the big circle, little circle too. Is there, from your perspective, is there one that maybe has more of a potential for impact in like today, right now? Is the entrepreneur the one with more capital momentum behind them potentially, or also in the context of a lot of us, making decisions about where we can go to have the most impact?
I think you have to answer that for yourself on different levels. Like for me, I try and hedge my bets. So I spent like 7-8 years working on entrepreneurship pretty solidly. And then I was like, maybe I should take a hedge against this formula because I didn't want to wear like suits partially. I didn't want to wear suits and like have to be kind of corporate and fake all the time. And then I also was like, well, I really believe in grassroots and citizen-based change. So let me go explore that a little bit. And that was part of my interest in doing the bus journey and connecting more with people at that level. And then I also believe in sort of this peninsula approach. So emerging forms of communities that are established, that are like plugged into the mainstream, the main lanes, but then also sort of have their own thing going on, and sort of there can be mutual flow. So I would just, hedge, and like there are different moments. I think it's helpful that I did like learn that old system and can have contacts and networks there. But I wouldn't want to spend my life there. And some other people are so much better at playing that game. Like my colleague Maggie, who started the League of Entrepreneurs with me, I feel like she's such a better ambassador for the movement, because sometimes I am more like, you should just die, like Shell, no offense, but like I don't, But and other days I wake up and I feel more positively about it, but yeah.
Okay, let's welcome our next group. Thanks, guys. Who's our next group?
Do you want to wear this coat?
Oh, maybe I should wear that.
It's really hot. But
Okay. This is much better.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, you mentioned the idea of the mesh prophecy. And we're discussing that idea as being really intriguing. But our question is centered around if you can have that idea of a mesh prophecy, the idea that there's a collective group that might, through a whole bunch of individual bits of insight, create a larger insight, how do you approach capturing that? And what is the sort of your insights in tackling that the promise, or the like? There's something really interesting there, but I'm definitely confounded by, is it possible even to tap into that?
Yeah, I think it's mesh prophecy is something too that I feel like is emerging for me as like a concept, and I think it's really just started because I started seeing people in very different parts of the world who had similar intuition and similar sort of pain, I would say. You know, in the sense that like a lot of our emotions are actually connected to these bigger things that are happening in the system. So like the price of oil will determine like interest rates, which determine the growth of the economy, which will like impact us immensely in terms of like how we're feeling, because they structure the pace, the like acceleration and deceleration of our lives. So in this way, we're all kind of connected at the structural level somewhat. And I guess it takes a belief in like the collective unconscious. So that's a little bit of a jump too, that you would have to sort of feel into this space where, I don't know, like even the neo-tribe concept seems to be resonating with everyone at the same time. Like we're all trying to figure out how to build these new communities and build these new tribes. Like the social entrepreneur moment. Like I met so many people who were jumping out of systems to become these social entrepreneurs. And now I feel like that was kind of a vanity entrepreneur moment. Like people were operating really individually, and now I feel like they're coming together again. So it's really what we've done to try and begin capturing some of this is just like hosting salons where you can go really deep with a group of people in a circle with a talking stick about like what is going on and what are we really feeling are like the rumblings of something new. In terms of the execution of mesh prophecy, like who are the people to sort of like bring some of that insight into the world? I think, you know, that's less egalitarian. We can all be feeling something, but only some people might be able to articulate it and have a role of like being a leader, or being a visionary, or sort of building, you know, an important piece of technology that is part of that moment. But I think even with the example that we saw earlier today of like, why did YouTube develop when YouTube developed? Why did Facebook develop when, you know, it was the sort of the magic of that historic moment. And I think the closer that, you know, people are to ideas often, it's not that it's your idea or you're an ego who sort of has this idea. It's like, oh, I witnessed this, or, you know, different things combined and clicked that were part of, you know, consciousness. And other people equally have access to those, and maybe they didn't click in quite the same ways, but often, you know, 6 degrees in Facebook did like come around or at a similar moment. So impossible question, like interesting space. But yeah, I don't know, what do you think?
Well, I think it really struck for me for sort of just a quick follow-up to that, which was that's both really challenging answer and really exciting at the same time. But I guess some of it, in the challenging piece is that's challenging to take that on, and like personally, in a sense.
What feels challenging about it?
Well, just there's work there.
Yeah.
But to follow would be how could you sort of test some as you if an individual is working to elucidate some of that insight, how can you test? Would there be any strategies to sort of test your own instincts or your intuition as you're doing the work of gathering and trying to articulate something that's coming from a large group?
So you would want what is your need to test is to see how valid that insight is?
Yeah, to I guess reflect it, I guess, in some ways. Are you resonating with people as you start to articulate it. If somebody who's trying to bring it out.
So one of the ideas that I had a few years ago that is a way of using humor to basically get at what you're doing is to set up this like American Idol for gurus. So you basically create this incubator for wannabe gurus. And I think the guru is sort of the nature, that's testable because people are attracted magnetically to different ideas or they're not attracted. So that could be a way that you sort of do this thing where different people with visions of the future that have hopefully been harvested from more sort of peer-to-peer sources can then see where there's magnetic pull. But I think it's ultimately a game too of like intuition. And that harvesting is, why did the Beatles, how did you test the Beatles? Because they had this following, right? But they were like doing something that was part of this moment that was so iconic. So yeah, I have no idea how you could test it. But yeah, maybe a fake guru reality show. Yeah.
In the same vein, when you're creating these structured forums and salons to sort of pull out these mesh insights, do you find yourself making assumptions to pull out the insights, or are they the kind of thing that sort of bubbles to the top and then it's really obvious?
Yeah, it's hard to describe this process of what actually happens. I think you're sort of like actively, it's pragmatic, I guess. You're like actively sort of like articulating amongst a group that's sort of reality checking you. So like as things come up, you're sort of like capturing and you're like mirroring back to the group what is being said. I think often, sometimes like I might articulate something a little bit differently, but I'm trying to crystallize the intuitions that a group has. Yeah. So I think it's just this process of sort of like
more of a natural,
a
natural collective insight among the group.
Yeah, and I think a lot of like synthesis work or sort of seeing trends too is just sort of being plugged into like what intuitively is going on, and it's hard because there's not like a language. Maybe I'll go to Brazil and I'll come back with a better language to talk about some of this in. But I feel like we're so, and this goes back to my mom's work with alien abduction actually, because we're so conditioned by this like Cartesian worldview that I don't even have a language to talk about intuition and like emergent futures really. And that's kind of sad. And so that goes back to alter egos too, because then we need to create characters that can sort of like give us access to new language that we can use. Yeah, sorry.
I'll just throw in there, Quendel, to your point, a friend recently was talking about a friend of hers who's highly political, definitely a misfit, who's been testing positions in different rabid political Facebook groups by sort of, he'll post the exact same statement on a Republican Facebook blog or he's been kicked out of several, but just to see how people's communities shape the way that they're responding. So I think one thing, as I think also about 50s and 60s entrepreneurs, is that one of the key differences now is the struggle may not be different, but the tools and access we have to different networks and to global groups allows us to play in different ways where the barriers are different, not better or lower necessarily, but different. Did you guys have questions?
Yeah, I've got a question. Looking at patterns and cycles in technology, and you were talking about how Silicon Valley is starting to overtake the U.S. with all these companies that are spreading their whatever across the country. And I look back in history, which most of us should remember, the dot-com era, and what happened back then, and that normalization that happened. Do you see similar patterns that are starting to emerge now with all these app developers? I mean, besides the world back then being about the public markets sort of shutting them down, most of these guys aren't public. So what do you see happening there in terms of normalizing the effect that they're having?
I think it's very similar to this like dot-com moment. I think it's also really dangerous because now there's such a dependency between this emerging sort of Silicon Valley scene and financial interests, which wasn't quite as strong before. I think you had finance that was going into sort of old like brick and mortar companies and primary economy in many ways. And I think there's something dangerous about our financial industry being sort of hijacked by not being like a hand servant, if you will, to the primary things that we all need, but getting rerouted into this digital economy space because value there feels very abstract. And so the valuations that a lot of these companies are getting like really worries me when we can't do basic things like price water and like price energy effectively, and yet like a like is suddenly like being valued above these types of things. And then I think the other point too to your question is like I really do value sort of, I guess just like very different types of cultures. Like I think it's a shame if we all get into one formula about like what a Silicon Valley sort of company should be like and different sort of metrics that get standardized around producing these copycat kinds of companies. I think we need like, I guess the parallel there would be like monoculture. Like monoculture doesn't serve us. And so how do we create very different types of like entrepreneurial scenes that are really based on like local values and different radically different types of economies rather than this like formula where we try and push everything into a very homogenous sort of space. Yeah.
So based on that, based on what's happening, how do you think that's shifting or pivoting and changing? Because it seems like there's no end to it.
Yeah. I mean, I think we'll have a massive crisis. I think that's part of it. I think like, and then I have my little intentional technology movement. So hopefully that's like what I'm doing. I don't know. I think it's really challenging. Yeah. And I think it will, I mean, what do you think? What is the future of sort of some of these Silicon Valley cultures for you?
Well, I think ultimately, I mean, there's so much of them there. The real estate, and we're talking specifically about the apps. There's only so much real estate, but I know, some people have 300 of these apps. Only maybe less than 1% of them get used on a regular basis. But the leaders in those organizations end up being such good salespeople and there's so much money there that if someone can sell a good enough reason, they're getting financing and money for it, which is wrong in my opinion. But I'm not sure what force is out there that could correct that, and that's why I don't think there is an answer. I don't know. In the .com, I mean, everyone was going public, and then finally the market said that's enough, and that kind of normalized everything and shut a lot of them down. But I don't see that happening anytime soon for a lot of these companies that really don't have any value that's being added, or they're copying other services or other solutions and getting a lot of money for that.
I agree, and I used to study economic history and love like the physiocrats and love these early economic theorists because they basically had very different ways of ascribing value, which was actually based on sort of like real assets. And it sounds kind of primitive, but there is something that, I need to believe that thing has like tangible value. And yeah, I mean, I think people are making different holdouts. Like there was one entrepreneur, for example, that we met in Wilmington, Ohio, who said, this is not going to become Silicon Valley. This is not going to become a place where we just let sort of big companies sort of be here for 10 years and we promote all those incentives and then they sort of move somewhere else. And so they really had this focus on local grassroots resilient economy. And so as much as there is constantly this startup Silicon Valley narrative, there are sort of communities that are going back to basics too in many ways and just saying like, we want to create resilient businesses. Etsy.org just launched a whole sort of track focused on regenerative entrepreneurship, which I think is amazing. And it's not flashy and innovative. It's like, no, these are like real businesses and we're thinking about our role in the community. But yeah.
So I have a follow-up to that, which is one from the audience, but it's great and it has to do with this issue of value. And so in looking at misfit economies, there's this question of what do you see in terms of the challenge of inviting others to participate in informal economies or integrating informal economies into the wider ones when there are these different or conflicting assignments of value? So for example, downtown East Side, we have the token program from Save On, or bike parts or pop cans or cashless and digital. So what do you see bubbling in terms of how those alternative economies might or might not get integrated?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the challenge of integration is less a challenge of value and more a challenge of just culture. And so even the program Defy Ventures, which takes all these former ex-cons and people that used to run successful drug businesses or things like this and puts them through a training program where they can connect with VC funding for legal enterprises. So much of that is just like, you know, how to behave, how do you sort of, the trust networks around these different things. Like if all of your connections are in the black market, in the gray market, and you show up to someone who's like running a VC firm, like you really just, you know, you don't know how to behave, you don't know how to game, you know, that system. And so then you do need like more of the like con artist, entrepreneur sort of type misfit to hijack that interaction a little bit. And I think you need, so one other important piece of groundwork is just like the empathy for this to even begin to happen. Like who, you know, how are we inviting some of these more marginalized cultures in? And even at our book launch party, we had all these amazing like moonshiners from Tennessee. We had a bunch of people from the Latin Kings there. We had George Young, who Johnny Depp played in the movie Blow, who was a big time like cocaine trafficker. We had David Victorson, who smuggled 37 tons of marijuana from Colombia to Seattle and then became a fantastic entrepreneur making millions of dollars on like rehab clinics. And so we had this, and then we had all these people from like the Impact Hub and like the startup scene in New York and friends of mine who had gone to Brown. And so it was like this really interesting sort of mashup, I suppose, of people. But there were also awkward dynamics. Like Freeway Rick Ross was there as well. He was like a cocaine dealer, and one of the guys from Brown was just like following him around and trying to be really like cool. But then Rick Ross was like taking like Instagram. So it was just like first steps, you know? I think we're just in this moment of like first steps, and moonshine can be helpful in that.
We didn't even talk about the camel milk chain.
I know.
Okay,
yeah.
so can we have one more participant group? Are there two who are dying, or are there a few people who have really burning questions? Thanks, gang.
Someone else.
And while they're coming up, Alexa, just to riff off of another question from the audience. So while you guys are coming up, yeah. We'll have one more group. So if you've got burning questions, this is it. But there was, on speaking about power and kind of who's marginalized, there was a question because we were kind of living in 2025 today. So if it's 2025, how is power distributed, managed, and used in various neo-tribes? And then I'll hand
Super interesting. So I guess one thing that appeared to me is like, I think power gets really good at shape-shifting. And so I remember like being recently in a conversation where someone used like a new age line of argument to like shut down a reaction I was having to something, where they were like, oh, I don't know what it was, or just like, but you can see ways in which different environments can be constructed with very new kinds of guises. So in fact, like meditation could actually be used as a tool of like repression in 2025. Like the more that Google gets people meditating, is that like increasing productivity and employees like service? So I just think there are ways in which we really have to like watch power and how it shapeshifts. So like geek patriarchy, I feel like that's gonna be very alive in 2025, and like how do we, unman that a little bit? I wonder like about hacker culture and how much longer that will survive too. I think that'll be a really interesting like matrix question. Yeah.
I was just curious, subcultures often adopt the structures of the hegemonic culture. So I was just curious about misfits within misfits, and also how, lots of times misfit culture revolves around truths that are not told. So when that truth sort of gets addressed and dealt with, kind of what happens next, like what's the progression of the misfit kind of trajectory?
When you say misfit cultures exist around truths that are not told, can you share a little bit more? That's interesting.
Yeah, at times, like even, let's say at schools, there are groups of misfits that observe social groups and social situations, and like there's the anti-prom misfit group. Yeah. And there's probably a real core truth underlying their thing besides just being anti-prom, Yeah. But there's like this agenda that kind of is maybe they feel like a truth isn't being addressed within the dominant culture. And so I guess even minority activist groups, it's sometimes about a truth not being addressed. So like that.
And how do they, like, what does their evolutionary path look like?
Yeah.
I think it's really challenging, and I think there are a lot of groups that fear sort of co-option and try and really actively prevent that. And so much of my work is actually about creating bridges between misfit cultures and mainstream cultures, and so that's a very real risk. Like, maybe these groups actually want to be more isolated so that some of their ideas aren't taken on board and bastardized. And so I think you just have to, you know, we're in an age where subcultures are constantly being recycled and their sort of meaning is being stripped away, and then they just become part of the mass. And that's why operating in this place of critique is really always necessary. And that's why I think the misfit subcultures that do pop up have to be really good at observing those that shape-shifting and like how power shape-shifts. So even within the social entrepreneur movement, you know, some people could say, oh, this is greenwashing, or oh, this is like corporate responsibility, it's not mainstream business. And you don't really know until you're actually there and you see like who's doing that battle and sort of what they're about and what they're programmed with. And so I try more to bet on, I guess, specific people and try and really, I think if there are many reasons when subcultures should stay isolated. Like even the Latin Kings, when they were trying to become more of a civic movement, that was a terrifying moment for them because suddenly this stealthy underground brand was being public about what it was doing and how it was building capacity of gang members, and they were staging sort of public events and protests, and a lot of the members felt uncomfortable with that. And felt like it was actually part of their demise.
Just as a quick comment, the origin of that also, I was thinking about, you know, in Christian churches, sometimes the misfits of those churches are actually the people that would fit in another culture, but they're sticking in as misfits within the misfit culture.
Yeah, and that's sometimes necessary too, right? Like, yeah.
I'm curious about, you mentioned the phrase intentional technology, so I'm kind of curious to hear a little bit more about that. And also whether or not that's connected to the idea of, you know, you were sort of talking about tech culture kind of colonizing areas and it being about grant funding and all of this stuff, and whether there's kind of possibilities for that virus or whatever you want to call that to kind of become more intentional or to kind of have a better social purpose.
Yeah, I just did a little piece on Medium recently that was like a framework for more intentional tech culture. And I don't remember what all those different elements of the framework were. One was definitely, you know, I was joking with a friend about like, well, why don't we create an incubator for startup founders that brings in like existential questions and brings in critical theory and just like has this kind of value hacking involved in it. I think that's really important. Long-term time horizons are also really important, and developing financial instruments too that allow for cooperative ownership. So there's a platform cooperativism event happening in New York maybe next week, which is amazing. It's basically saying like, hey, sharing economy companies, you're meant to be sharing economy companies, and yet you're exploiting your workers in a lot of different ways. So again, that's like power shape-shifting. So how do you bring that cooperative, you know, democratic ownership into some of these emergent tech companies? So I think there were maybe sort of like 8 different variables that were part of this framework. And very much, I think my own sort of agency is more tied to sort of direct interventionist work and like program and curriculum building. So that's where I can play. But I think other people can play in terms of like developing financing products and thinking about organizational structures that are more cooperative and stuff like this. Yeah.
So thank you for the compliment about us thinkers being a little lost in a misfit group of our own. Yeah. I think as misfits, one of the things that is a question for me that I would love your thoughts on is it's not my ambition to stay a misfit forever. I would like for whatever misfit culture or movement that we create to become mainstream. So what would be the catalysts for the misfit culture to become so attractive that it can become mainstream? And how do you design this misfit group with the resilience to survive that transition from being an on-the-edge organization that moves fast and is sort of contrarian and, you know, at the leading edge into the core structure?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I guess the first thing that popped into mind was like the Marxist who's, there's this joke of like, oh, I waited for the revolution, and when the revolution came, it was the wrong one. And so I think that's a shame, is like, as much as like we feel ourselves as like active agents in bringing about this transformation, you know, sometimes the transformation or the revolution just comes like from a totally different trajectory. I also think it's important to create space. Like I would never want to assert my misfit culture or personality as the like raison d'etre of the entire world. And so when I think about my own mainstreaming, it's really actually, I want to be able to sort of to exist in my own misfitness and have other people be able to exist in their own misfitness. And that's part of like the democratic thing that I feel like I've signed up for. Rather than this coup d'etat, which is like, oh, this think culture is actually going to take over the world, which would, well, I mean, is that what it looks like for you? Or what are, when you talk about this misfit culture mainstreaming, what does that vision look like? What does that picture look like?
Well, my impression from working with this group, very talented, diverse group, who are idealists, yeah. I feel that they're looking at the world saying, the status quo, there's a lot of areas that could be better. And so I see the ambition of this group as very much, how can we make that better? Yeah. And right now we're the voices saying, hello, has anybody thought about that? And we're not necessarily being heard, and we're not necessarily getting traction, or we're not necessarily understood in the process of doing that. And so what happens when suddenly one day you're no longer the voice and you become the status quo? And now everybody is sort of turning things around, where there's always something else to improve. So do you have any examples of misfit cultures? How did gangsters become sort of, how did people start taking gangster culture and gangster structures into the corporate world? Like what happened there that it was okay and yeah.
Well, it's still not, I mean, it's still sort of, I don't know if like, how, yeah. But it reminds me too, because I think within economic history, you had this interesting moment when industrial capitalism was born, where people who were part of this at the time innovative, emergent, like against this kind of hoarding impetus, you had people that were like, well, how do we behave in this industrial capitalism? And there would have been like a think-esque like program where people would have thought about it and sort of written, and this is like, oh, well, this is how sort of money works, and this is how factories should be organized, and efficiency and specialization are these great things. And now we're in this other moment where it's like, oh, creativity and empathy and collaboration are these great things, and we're not just about command and control systems, but it's, you know, it's an evolution on that. And I think it does come down to persona. Like so often it's like, well, what are the practices, and groups like this form, what are the practices that I need to embody on a daily basis to be part of like this emergent world? And I think that happens every time you have a big economic shift. It's like people are sort of being part of that conversation. And then there's another generation that comes along that sort of will devalue some of those things because they feel like it's suffocating for them. And so as much as like we have lived in this history that feels like a straitjacket of capitalism and are trying to sort of break out of that, there are also things that maybe we can do a better job of saying, well, what do I actually like about that system that's existing? And that could be a, yeah, powerful conversation too.
Maybe a really simple question. It seems like you're often a misfit, but very different misfits. Do you feel like you're a misfit at the moment? Mm-hmm. And what kind?
Sometimes I feel like more and less of a misfit. Like I was in San Miguel in Mexico recently talking to someone who thought he was created by Immaculate Conception and that he was an alien. So in this moment I felt a lot like a misfit. And then, yeah, I went into Mexico City the next day and did like a talk and felt less like a misfit, like more I was sort of like in this. So for me, I think I like playing both roles, and I like being able to access culture. Like, I like being able to sort of go into a corporate setting and being able to do that effectively. And I like being able to sort of go and speak to gangsters and feel like I can have some of that access too. Yeah, so it's maybe like one day this whole misfit thing, because we've already sort of authenticity has evolved, won't exist, and it's more just about entering into different landscapes and territories that we want to at different moments. Yeah.
So our last question, and then we'll wrap up and we can kind of mingle, and we've got Alexa's books if you happen to want to have one signed. But I know this comes from Sarah, who's got 2 little ones, and wonders, how does she raise a misfit? It's from you, right? Yeah. Yeah. How would one go about successfully raising a misfit or 2?
Boom.
Future of misfits.
Future misfit education.
I think Jasper's on his way.
He is. I mean, I went to alternative schools for a lot of my life, so maybe your alter ego of homeschooling isn't so bad. But I think self-directed learning is really important. I think, you know, allowing kids to just, they have an intuition about what they're passionate about, and really sort of cultivating that, and not being this sort of helicopter parent, but allowing them to really explore and experience awe and wonder. I think everything that I try and do comes from this place of like awe and wonder, and this desire to sort of be part of that. And I think that was because as a kid, that's how my educational environments were set up. So the reason that I can't sort of plug into a traditional job is because I have this like formula for curiosity that informs how I go about in the world. So definitely this, fun costumes. I think like hacking family dynamics is really important. Like the alter ego stuff applied to families where like in these nuclear relationships, we suddenly feel like, oh, I'm always the like responsible one or the youngest or da-da. So I think enabling families to have this sense of sort of improvisation and spontaneity where people are encouraged to take on different roles so that like one sibling doesn't feel like, you know, they have to be the studious one because another sibling is being fun or something like this. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, there's so much to be gleaned between the lines of everything you shared. And we're so grateful to have you in our midst. We know you have many touch points to the various misfit communities, and it's nice to see some intersecting faces. So huge thank you, Alexa. And this whole session will be up and available on the Disruptive Innovation Festival website for everyone. And Alexa is here to hang out with us. We have a small gift for you, which Sarah brings over.
Amazing, thank you.
Is our lovely journal for reflecting.
Oh, awesome.
Since an opportunity to
What is this your symbol?
Tell us what you think the symbols are, because there's 2 different ones on 2 different sides. If you look at the spine, it might help.
Oh.
What do we think?
So, is this meant to be super obvious?
No.
This is
I mean,
like
yes, no.
Yeah,
Well,
semiotic.
so part of the.
I see.
What do you
You're
see?
gonna
What
like
do you see?
understand my psychology.
Okay. You want to Rorschach test it for us?
This is like mountain and sun or moon, and this is like water and something Vancouver-y, I don't know.
Okay. Close, good. No, it's close. So we talk about having head in the clouds and feet on the ground in order to actually turn ideas into action. So we think ideas for spreading are great, but we are really about action and putting things into practice, and the necessity to both dream and bring reality and move things forward. So thus the 2 halves of the book, depending on which half you're in. But anyways, big thank you from our audience. Thank you, Alexa. Super cool.